Death is a terrifying constant that has been realized since the very beginning as an important step in the cycle of life, yet continues to prove itself utterly incomprehensible to this day because of its enigmatic unpredictability. While the concept itself is quite simple to grasp on the surface, as all things that begin naturally end at some point or another, it is the means of reaching this stage that continues to invoke fear in us and perplex the human mind, be it either due to natural causes when the time is right, or prematurely through nature's intervention. Not even in the realm of media that we often associate with an escape from reality can we avoid this sort of sensitive topic, as countless artists show little hesitation in utilizing this idea to convey powerful emotions in the narrative and audience alike. Whether inviting an opportunity for character development, increasing the stakes in a tense situation, or causing an instantaneous shift in tone, death bears a powerful influence that should not be underestimated when used by the right hands. One genre that understands the importance of this execution and hardly ever seems to fail in is sci-fi, as its horrific undertones of what lies beyond the final frontier are complemented heavily by their shared infinity of creative potential. No two fates are mutual in the cold void of space, but one notion always remains the same. Death in isolation is a dreadful and depressing endeavor. To be so remotely separated from your homeworld, colleagues, and everything you've ever known, it's enough to drive anyone into a frenzy of space madness. Yet to quote Ridley Scott's Alien, "In space, no one can hear you scream." Perhaps due to its direct inspiration from this film, Metroid is an IP that offers an experience unlike anything else found in Nintendo's library. While a handful of other titles from this company are not afraid to tackle this topic alongside other similarly dark themes, such as The Legend of Zelda, Fire Emblem, and Xenoblade, the many assets that are uniquely present in Metroid's genre of choice, as well as its distinctive strategy to passive storytelling, allows the franchise to expand the concept of death to its audience by stimulating the imagination and enticing critical analysis from multiple different lenses. This approach culminates in the Metroid Prime trilogy when shifting the immersion into the first-person perspective, as putting the players into the Varia suit itself allows these discoveries and encounters to feel much more grounded and personal, as opposed to experiencing a sort of spectator role in the traditional 2D formula. Along with this, the introduction of the scan visor proves itself a valuable tool to this aspect of the narrative by drawing in curious players with the prospect of finer contextual information, before cursing them with knowledge that can range from in-depth explanations of the victim's cause of death, estimated time of passing, and even their prior emotional state on occasion. In today's video, I will be categorizing these viewpoints into 3 different themes and observing death within this trilogy by picking out examples across each installment that demonstrate their ideas and this concept's overall importance the most efficiently. I'm Mew-TubeHK, and this is the utility of death in the Prime trilogy. Before we commence this analysis, let us first identify these 3 lenses to contextualize the importance of each example and understand what is being looked for. I have categorized these outlooks as brutal, horrific, and tragic. In my research, brutal and horrific prove to be almost interchangeable with one another due to their shared fixation on violent depictions and definition. This video will attempt to separate the two by associating these aspects with brutal death, as horrific death will place greater emphasis on the clever usages of phobias to unnerve the audience, as well as taking note of the victim's emotional state and the intensity of the environment they are found in. Tragic death also shares this psychological importance, but will be much easier to recognize, as its primary goal is to ingrain a sense of sympathy in the player instead of deterring them. And as an additional disclaimer, while this video's focus will prioritize the Prime trilogy, I will also include examples from other titles in the series to a much lesser extent, as their acknowledgement will further validate and strengthen the relevance of each lens. With that all established, let us start where it all began for Metroid's evolution into 3D. Compared to Echoes and Corruption, Metroid Prime holds the strongest value in the theme of isolation, as the narrative sees Samus traversing Talon 4 with minimal assistance in the form of friendly NPCs or the like. Because of this, it was tricky to associate these forms of death with anyone or anything outside of the existence of the space pirates, yet the examples they provide still satisfy these conditions effectively because of their sentience. A strong candidate for both brutal and horrific death comes directly from this game's opening moments, as we see Samus investigate the frigate Orpheon after intercepting an unidentifiable distress signal. While the station is described as derelict at first, and we are welcomed with a rather tame tutorial section, it is not until Samus enters the vessel that the tone and atmosphere of the situation take a full 180. This ship has taken massive structural damage. Fire rages as if to symbolize stepping fresh into hell, and many space pirates, either dead or barely alive, are scattered throughout its corridors. This style of tonal shift conceptualizes Metroid's core belief in the importance of death's utilization, taking advantage of environmental storytelling and the fear of the unknown to increase tension in the narrative, while simultaneously horrifying and demoralizing the player. A few non-Prime scenarios that also practice this technique include Ceres's remains in Metroid Fusion, the dried-up corpses in Torian in Super Metroid, and arguably even the hidden Chozo memory in Metroid Samus Returns. The presence of death in these instances subverts the audience's expectations by faking the player out of an immediate sense of danger, yet still suspending an air of mystery. This, in turn, results in triggering a response of paranoia in the form of unresolved questions that tempt the player to discover these answers amidst their hesitation, such as how these specimens could have ended up in this state, what events could have transpired leading up to them, the whereabouts of the individuals responsible for causing them, and so on. For the space pirates stranded on the Orpheon, let us first look at their deaths from a horrific perspective, as these events from their point of view can be quite petrifying. When looking back at their distress beacon, you may recall that it was described as unidentifiable, meaning that anyone locating this signal would have no clue that it came from space pirates until they properly traced its source. Samus's acquisition of the beacon also displays that the pirates were utterly unconcerned with who would be on the receiving end, as its lack of solid encryption implies that they were not specifically asking for assistance from friendly forces. This was a general, desperate call for help from the space pirates, and to see their mortal enemy of all entities answer their plea in their dying moments, it is of no wonder that those on the verge would open fire regardless of their wounds. These casualties in question present themselves as rather horrific as well, with many pirates suffering from body horror adjacent fates, such as severing the spinal cord, bite marks taken out of the victim's exoskeleton, untreatable fractures in both legs, and more. Brutal death, while subsidiary in this game, is what I would classify all other fatalities aboard this facility, as these miscellaneous deaths include severe internal damage, excessive blunt trauma to the cranium, burns applied to the body by both acid and flames, and so on. As we move on to tragic death, I found myself unable to associate this lens with the space pirates, for they are certainly not a faction meant to garner condolences despite how horrible they have it. Instead, I would argue that Prime's tragedy is found primarily in the ecological death of Talon 4 itself following the arrival of Phazon. What was once referred to as a biological paradise, with life natural enough to entice its Chozo inhabitants to abandon their technology altogether, this world would eventually find itself on the receiving end of a Leviathan seed, leading space pirates to estimate that it would only last 25 more years post-impact. Flagra of the Chozo ruins is the most prevalent demonstration of the effects that this great poison cursed upon the surface, mutating what might have initially been the pride of the Chozo's vegetation into a hulking monster responsible for reducing the ruin's water supply into toxic sludge. Other major environmental changes, while perhaps artificial as opposed to natural, include the space pirates erecting their research base in Phendrana Drifts to further their mutation experiments, and the construction of the Phazon mines to obtain greater quantities of this resource. Not even the Chozo present here would be spared by Phazon, as though a handful would successfully escape into the cosmos to avoid its wrath, many others would lose their lives going manic from this substance and eventually become Chozo ghosts. Between the desertion of its foreign caretakers, this viral infection eating away at the planet, and the invasive space pirates desecrating what remains for their own gain, it is a miracle that this planet would eventually speak of revival in later installments. Speaking of, having thoroughly discussed these lenses, it is time we move on to a much heavier chapter of this trilogy, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. This game deviates slightly from its predecessor in that its emphasis on creating harsh atmosphere is now shared between isolation and oppression, demanding the player to interact with a more hostile environment at all times, unlike the docile Talent 4. Most of this adventure is spent exploring the dimension of Dark Ether, a parallel world that brutally punishes the player with the threat of encroaching death for every passing second they spend there. Despite its passive presentation by comparison, this approach is still strongly effective thanks to its direct correlation with the audience from the first-person perspective, as the difficulty envisioned by Kensuke Tanabe reflects upon this immersion and generates a sense of urgency in both the gameplay and plot. Without proper management of resources and optimization of movement, complete with lengthy distances between each save room, an unfortunate death here would easily exhaust the player by forcing them to retread areas they have already explored and engage in battles they have already fought. The influence of Dark Ether and its consequences from prolonged exposure are shown to be quite horrific as well, be it through the method behind their demise or the assertive defiling of their remains. The space pirates exemplify this once more when entering the appropriately named doomed entry of the Dark Aegon Wastes, as we are greeted by a squadron whose lives had evidently been snuffed almost immediately upon arrival. These casualties include one experiencing organ failure when taking in the planet's miasma, another having their spine shattered by a high-velocity impact, and the last, most quizzically, rebelling against their own members as hypothesized by evidence of parasitic infestation. We are conditioned to understand this concept of full-body possession when encountering the Dark Troopers much earlier in the adventure, a reanimated zombification of the Galfid corpses left behind on Ether. While it goes without saying why these undead organisms are held in such high regard when it comes to horror, one inconsistent aspect in their depictions is their resilience, as their tenacity to cling to the semblance of life accurately reflects their threat level. Echoes opts to prioritize the narrative here over difficulty by depicting these beings as rather pitiful, even going as far as to make the Dark Missile Trooper boss not much more than an afterthought, as an incomplete parasitic fusion invites the thought that these victims still hold fast to some humanism instead of fully embracing the supernatural. This hijacking capability ultimately belongs to the Ing, a hive mind partial to Dark Ether that acts as the game's antagonistic force and bears resemblance to most insectoids in both appearance and behavior, making any fatality related to them a nightmare for those that suffer from entomophobia. Not even the Luminoth are safe from this corruption and are entirely susceptible to being usurped, as can be seen by one case outright committing suicide if it meant preventing their psyche from being overrun. Countless lives have been lost to this overwhelming faction, and Echoes does not cut corners when utilizing them to expand on its universe, describe its tragedies in finer detail, and so on. This alternative routine serves to identify the opposite end of the spectrum that Metroid defines death, as its conflicts can also be intensified with strong emotional feedback and incentivize a justification for both Samus and the player to see their adventure fulfilled. This is typically realized through the theme of sacrifice, exemplified predominantly by instances such as the baby Metroid granting Samus the Hyper Beam during Super Metroid, and Quiet Robe disabling the remaining Emmy against Ravenbeak's jurisdiction in Metroid Dread. The execution of these set pieces allows them to effectively play a key role in fueling this impulsive emotion, catching players when they are most vulnerable, and swiftly manipulating the narrative from a simple extrinsic motivation for Samus into an intrinsic ulterior goal for the player. While many of Samus's adventures have her exploring a hostile planet in exchange for further exposure to a concerning point of interest, these instances display how they often conclude as well, avenging a fallen comrade by generating a yearning for revenge within the audience, and bolstering the satisfaction that comes from carrying it out. We find the GFMC compound littered with the corpses of deceased Galfed soldiers, as a brief flashback cutscene retells their abrupt fate from an overwhelming Ing assault while hunting down a rogue band of space pirates. While this scene correlates heavily with the theme of horrific death from a visual standpoint, I strongly associate it with tragic death for this analysis due to its unprecedented occurrence, the log entries left behind by the squadron, and how this grief taps directly into the audience's indomitable spirit. Each of these entries accurately reveals these troopers' doubts and incompetence regarding this change in objective, such as characters like Brode running low on ammunition despite their stinginess, Milligan finding solace in the boredom as others do the dangerous work, and a lack of mental fortitude causing Haley to go outright deranged from paranoia. A Marine named Angseth is also referred to in these entries, mentioning Samus by name and seeming to revere the bounty hunter as a celebrity or potential personal hero, whom she shall no longer be able to meet due to this terrible fate. These emotional states amidst this undoing thus prevent these disheveled souls from a peaceful rest. Only knowing so once Samus's proper discovery of their demise not only visibly strengthens her resolve to uncover this planet's mystery, but also tempts the player to prove their resilience compared to these poor individuals. Shortly following this, we are officially introduced to more tragedy in the form of the Luminoth through our meeting with Umos, who were once much more native to Ether before the Ing drastically decreased their numbers. The city-esque appearance of the Sanctuary Fortress's skybox puts into scope the sheer scale of this community's genocide, implying that this portion of the planet used to be a collective residential district. Many Luminoth remains are scattered about Ether and its dark counterpart, with each of their autopsies including a time frame as to how long ago their lives had ended by measurement of centicycles and decacycles. An earlier Q&A with this game's development team informs us that a Luminoth cycle is roughly 3 years on Earth, and with the largest known recording of these being 3.8 decacycles, being equivalent to 114 years, these factoids assess just how long this race has struggled with conflict even prior to the Ether incident. While Samus's efforts would allow this planet and its inhabitants to also make a comeback by the final act of the trilogy, the lasting effects of this crisis are visualized once the remaining Luminoth awaken from their stasis, making it apparent that there are now, as we officially know of, 9 remaining Luminoth in the entire galaxy. To keep this train of heart-wrenching tragedy going, I would argue that Metroid Prime 3 Corruption is the most plentiful of these titles regarding this death, as we segue into the final installment of this analysis. While isolation is still present to a degree in select portions of this game's featured planets, it is of noticeably lower priority here because of the narrative's greater focus on characterization and introducing the audience to a colorful cast that never makes them feel truly alone. While this opens up further possibilities for players to develop close attachments to these characters, there are a few such cases that jeopardize Metroid's definition of death. Dark Samus reappears as Corruption's main antagonist following their hinted return at the end of Echoes, as the specifics of accomplishing their resurrection in this teaser are still kept fairly vague to this day. This would not be this franchise's most egregious example of reoccurring characters though, as Ridley, who also makes an additional appearance here, has become infamous for 5 total instances across the chronology where he engages in combat against Samus. Graphical limitations of each respective era may be to blame for this supposed resilience, as a majority of these defeats in the 2D era see Ridley fall similarly to other bosses, this being combusting into flames and going out in a blaze of glory. Metroid Other M would actually do something correct here and reintroduce Ridley as a clone with a natural evolution line, cementing literal weight into his ultimate demise post-Super and justifying his reappearance, before ensuring that no traces of him would be left after his cryogenic corpse is shattered in Metroid Fusion. Despite how these specimens opt to explain themselves, however, they serve as strong evidence that this series is not above bending its own rules if it means establishing iconic figureheads to strengthen its recognizability. To narrow our analysis to a particular example, we'll focus on the 3 major roles we are acquainted with for this adventure: Gore, Rundas, and Gandreda. These fellow bounty hunters and former allies would eventually suffer full-body corruption from Phazon and serve as major bosses for their respective planets, each introducing an interesting hybrid of the 3 lenses once Samus is forced to subdue them. Gore's is the most straightforward, as it is established early on that his split personality is determined by whether or not he is piloting his armor suit. When being absorbed by Dark Samus, he is forcibly detached from his exoskeleton, meaning he has taken on his passive disposition and is likely experiencing strong emotion in whatever remains of his psyche. Samus's attempts to rescue him during this scenario are also displayed to be in vain, as she is left to watch helplessly at this tragic, unpreventable death. Gandreda mixes this lens with horrific death because of her shape-shifting abilities, as her final moments include her taking our hunter's shape directly. The common trope of this archetype cycling through each of their previous forms during their death sequence can often be viewed as the individual trying to adapt to their doomed situation. Gandreda's efforts at taking the form of the strongest being she knows ultimately fail her, thus painting a grim foreshadowing for Samus and the audience that our protagonist may not survive this adventure. Lastly, Rundas goes out in quite the brutal fashion, as his defeat results in being suddenly impaled by a stalagmite of ice. The unprompted nature of this occurrence visualizes this injury as vicious and fatal, even more so when considering Rundas's curious behavior prior. His defeat at the hands of Samus appears to briefly regain some sentience in him, leaving players to interpret if this was intentional in an attempt to prevent himself from being absorbed, or if it was by influence of the Phazon in his system or Dark Samus themselves. While Metroid Prime reflected on brutal death primarily through the casualties of the space pirates, Corruption instead pivots this focal point towards the mortalities of the Galfed soldiers, especially aboard the ruins of the GFS Valhalla. Having been on the receiving end of a new level of savagery from the space pirates 4 whole months prior to the game's events, as revealed to us by Galfed reconnaissance drones,
as you can see by the extent of the damage, the savagery of the attack is remarkable, even for space pirates.
Many of these marines can be found scattered about its wreckage in various forms of exploration. The many sealed-off vacuums and shattered windows implied that a large portion of this calamity's victims were left forfeit to the empty void of space, making a definitive body count uncertain. Regardless, many of the deaths that are still present reveal to us an assault too violent, sudden, and cunning for these unfortunate souls to have properly prepared for. A few noteworthy examples include full-body impalement from pirate melee weapons, broken necks from sheer physical trauma, and point-blank execution of those barely holding to life. As we transition into our final discussion point, this location also holds relevance in the topic of horrific death, as the traces of Phazon and the inhabitants of Phazon Metroids here show us just how dreadful these humans have it this time around. The Aurora Access greets us with 2 decaying Galfed troopers, one rotting away from full-body corruption, as another is consumed directly by the parasite for reasons unknown. The discovery of this foreboding setting is complemented heavily by a much more haunting ambience, firmly visualizing just what happens to an individual when this corruptive resource is not properly managed. Hyper mode further exemplifies this prospect of being overtaken by this parasite, as overloading at any point in the game will result in Samus losing her sense of self and mutating into an entirely separate Dark Samus in an alternative game over screen. The Phazon Metroids allow the lifeless husks of Super Metroid to make their 3D debut in this series as well, as many of these brittle corpses reside in their respective graveyards of both the Valhalla and the depths of Skytown, and indirectly serve as warnings of the horrors that are to come. However, there is something to be desired from this form of death, as these scorched carcasses only exist from Metroids feeding off of their prey's life energy. This curious concept has given rise to in-universe research every so often, yet has never been properly explained to this day, raising many questions such as what form this matter takes, why an individual cannot live without it, and what role the concept of life fulfills in the Metroid franchise in contrast to death. That may be a topic for another video though, so let us wrap up this deep dive by bringing everything together and associating each lens where I believe they are expressed the strongest. The usage of death in the Metroid Prime trilogy and its accompanying immersion elevate this franchise's atmosphere to great heights, be it by sympathy from connection with the loss of life, or a warning of anticipation with the foreshadowing of a more dominant threat. For Metroid Prime, the opening act of the frigate Orpheon makes horrific death its most effective lens, as its stark implementation of intensifying the setting at a moment's notice characterizes what this understanding means within the IP as a whole. For Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, while tragic death is an honorable mention in part of the Galfed troopers and the Luminoth, I would have to argue that brutal death is to an exceeding effect here, as its importance is flawlessly interlaced with the gameplay and allows the possibility to always be on the player's mind. Metroid Prime 3 Corruption would be the title to utilize Tragic Death the strongest, as its unique application across the three hunters introduces an entirely new layer to how these lenses can be practiced, and all convey their own appropriate emotional responses. By the time this video is released, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond will likely be just around the corner, and I cannot wait to see how this new entry conveys these ideas. That officially wraps up this analysis/appreciation video. This project has been on my mind for quite some time now, and I realized that the eventual release of Metroid Prime 4 Beyond essentially gave it a time limit, so I hope that you all found this video enjoyable, despite the amount of stress that it gave me. If that is the case, be sure to give it a like, throw me some hype, or even subscribe if you feel so inclined. I may not upload very frequently due to fluctuating motivation, but if you truly enjoy the effort that I put into these video essays, then I would very much appreciate it. Be sure to leave any comments you may have as well, as there are certainly many examples that I could not cover in one video alone. Cheers to all my viewers, and we will talk again next video.